The dust-laden wind whipped across Primrose Gulch as Penelope Davis clutched her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders. Her chin held high despite the jeering laughter that followed her like an unwelcome shadow. It was 1876, and the mining town that had once promised so much now seemed like a prison of judgment and scorn. "Look at the schoolmarm trying to walk like she's somebody," called out a voice from the saloon porch, followed by more derisive chuckles. Penelope had arrived in this Colorado frontier town just 6 months prior, fresh-faced and full of dreams at 22 years old. The daughter of a Boston academic, she had come west with notions of bringing education to children who might otherwise never learn their letters. What she hadn't counted on was the resistance from a town that viewed book learning with suspicion, especially when delivered by an unmarried woman from back east. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, a lonely sentinel against ignorance. Today, like most days, only 5 children had attended her lessons. The town council was threatening to close the school entirely by winter if attendance didn't improve. "Miss Davis, Miss Davis," a small voice called out from behind her. Penelope turned to see Sally Jenkins, one of her brightest students, running toward her with something clutched in her tiny hand. The girl's mother, a laundress who worked herself to the bone to keep food on their table, was one of the few adults in town who supported Penelope's efforts. "What is it, Sally?" Penelope asked, grateful for the interruption from her melancholy thoughts. "I made this for you," the child said, presenting a small, rough drawing of what appeared to be Penelope standing before a group of children. Penelope's heart swelled as she knelt to the child's level. "It's beautiful, Sally, thank you." As she straightened, a new round of laughter erupted from across the street. The miners were coming off shift, filthy and exhausted, but never too tired to mock the fancy lady teacher. "Just ignore them," Sally whispered, her young face concerned beyond her years. "I try to," Penelope replied, her voice catching. She patted the child's shoulder. "Run along home now, your mother will be waiting." As Sally scampered away, Penelope squared her shoulders and continued her walk toward her small rented room behind the general store. She was so focused on maintaining her dignity that she didn't notice the lone rider approaching until his horse's shadow fell across her path. "Afternoon, madam," came a deep voice that somehow managed to sound both rough and gentle at once. Penelope looked up to see a man astride a magnificent chestnut stallion. Unlike the miners and shopkeepers of Primrose Gulch, this stranger wore the dust of the trail as naturally as others might wear a fine suit. His face was partially shadowed by the brim of his hat, but she could make out a strong jaw dusted with stubble and eyes the color of a summer sky. "Good afternoon," she replied cautiously, unused to being addressed with anything resembling respect by men in this town. He dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent more time in the saddle than on solid ground. "Name's Knox Lawson," he said, removing his hat and revealing a shock of sun-streaked brown hair. "Just rode in, looking for the sheriff's office. Straight ahead, 3rd building on the right," Penelope said, gesturing down the main street. "Sheriff Bolton should be there unless he's at the saloon." Knox nodded his thanks but made no move to remount. Instead, he studied her with a gaze that felt unexpectedly perceptive. "You're not from around here originally," he observed. "Is it that obvious?" she asked with a small smile. "About as obvious as the fact that those men over there don't appreciate whatever it is you bring to this town," he replied, nodding toward the group still watching them from the saloon porch. Penelope's smile faded. "They laughed when I walked by," she said, the admission slipping out before she could stop it. The cowboy's expression hardened slightly as he glanced toward the men, then softened as he looked back at her. "Then let them watch you ride home proud," he answered, his voice carrying just enough for the onlookers to hear. Before Penelope could respond, Knox was leading his horse toward her. "May I escort you to wherever you're headed, Miss Davis?" "Penelope Davis," she supplied, suddenly conscious of her plain dress and wind-blown hair. "And that's not necessary, Mr. Lawson. I wouldn't want to delay your business with the sheriff." "Knox," he corrected, "and Bolton can wait a spell." "Man's been waiting his whole life to be important. Another few minutes won't hurt him." Despite herself, Penelope laughed. It was the first genuine laugh she'd experienced in months. "There now," Knox said, smiling. "That's more fitting for a fine day like today." Penelope was about to protest again when another round of comments floated over from the saloon. "Looks like the schoolmarm's found herself a cowboy. Bet she don't know which end of a horse to feed." Knox's expression darkened momentarily. Without a word, he unfastened a small leather bag from his saddle and handed Penelope the reins of his horse. "Hold Thunder for a moment, would you?" Before she could object, Knox strode purposefully toward the saloon. Penelope stood frozen, the massive chestnut stallion surprisingly gentle as it nudged her shoulder. She watched as Knox approached the group of men, his posture relaxed, but somehow conveying a quiet danger. She couldn't hear what was said, but the laughter died quickly. One man, Bart Hollister, the most persistent of her tormentors, stood up straighter, his hand twitching near his belt. Knox merely stood his ground, saying something else that made Hollister's face flush red. After a tense moment, the men dispersed, retreating into the saloon with backward glances. Knox returned to Penelope, taking the reins back with a nod of thanks. "Sorry about that, just clearing the air." "What did you say to them?" she asked, both apprehensive and curious. "Nothing worth repeating to a lady," Knox replied with a small smile. "Now about that escort." This time Penelope nodded. "I live behind Mercer's general store." They walked in silence for a moment, the horses' hooves making dull thuds in the dusty street. Penelope was acutely aware of the stares following them. Knox seemed oblivious or perhaps merely accustomed to being watched. "So what brings a man like you to Primrose Gulch?" she finally asked. "We're hardly on the main trail to anywhere." Knox adjusted his hat. "I go where the work takes me. Right now, that work is finding a man who's been robbing stage coaches between here and Denver. You're a lawman." Penelope asked, surprised. "Not exactly. Let's just say I help return things to their rightful owners." "A bounty hunter, then." Knox chuckled. "Some call it that. I prefer problem solver." They reached the small wooden building that housed Mercer's store. Behind it stood an even smaller structure, Penelope's humble lodging. "This is me," she said, stopping at the narrow path that led around to the back. Knox nodded, looking from the building to the schoolhouse visible at the town's edge. "You're the teacher," he realized aloud. "For now," Penelope confirmed. "Though if attendance doesn't improve, the council will close the school by first snow." Something flashed in Knox's eyes, recognition, perhaps, or understanding. "Education's a precious thing," he said quietly, "especially out here." "Not everyone shares that view," Penelope replied, thinking of the council meeting scheduled for the following evening. Knox seemed to consider something for a moment. Then he said, "Perhaps I'll see you around town, Miss Davis. I expect I'll be here a while." "Perhaps," she agreed, surprised by how much she hoped it would be true. As Knox tipped his hat and turned to lead Thunder toward the sheriff's office, Penelope felt the weight of watching eyes. But for the first time since arriving in Primrose Gulch, she didn't feel diminished by their stares. Instead, she stood a little straighter and walked to her door with her head held high. Inside her simple room, Penelope set down her books and went to the small mirror hanging on the wall. Her reflection showed a young woman with determined hazel eyes and chestnut hair pulled back in a practical style. Her father had always said she had her mother's features, delicate, yet strong, like fine porcelain that had survived being dropped. "Then let them watch you ride home proud," she repeated to herself, wondering about the stranger who had appeared like a character from one of her books, the kind her students were too young to read, and the adults of Primrose Gulch would never pick up. Knox Lawson was unlike anyone she'd met in this dusty corner of Colorado. And despite all her practical sense, Penelope Davis found herself hoping their paths would cross again. Morning arrived with the harsh glare of sunlight through Penelope's thin curtains. She rose quickly, accustomed to making the most of daylight hours. Today was Wednesday, which meant arithmetic lessons for the older children and reading practice for the younger ones. It was also the day before the town council would vote on the school's future. As she dressed in her second-best dress, a sensible navy blue with white collar, Penelope tried to focus on her lessons rather than the council meeting or the mysterious Knox Lawson. Both thoughts proved distracting in entirely different ways. She had just finished pinning up her hair when a knock came at her door unexpected, as few people ever visited her here. Opening it cautiously, she was surprised to find Mrs. Jenkins, Sally's mother, standing there with worry etched across her tired face. "Miss Davis, forgive the early call," the woman said, twisting her worn apron in her hands. "Not at all, Mrs. Jenkins. Is something wrong? Is Sally ill?" "No, miss, but I've just heard from Mrs. Mercer that the council's already decided to close the school regardless of tomorrow's vote, Mrs." Jenkins lowered her voice. "Mr. Hollister's been gathering signatures, saying the town can't afford to waste money on schooling when the children will just end up working the mines or marrying young anyway." Penelope felt her heart sink. "But the vote isn't until tomorrow evening." "That's just for show," according to Mrs. Mercer. "Her husband sits on the council and he says the decision's already been made." Mrs. Jenkins looked genuinely distressed. "Sally loves your lessons so much, Miss Davis. She's already reading better than I ever could." Penelope squared her shoulders. "Thank you for telling me, Mrs. Jenkins. Rest assured, I'll be at that council meeting tomorrow, and I'll not let them dismiss education without a proper hearing." After Mrs. Jenkins left, Penelope gathered her teaching materials with trembling hands. The thought of failing these children, of returning east with her purpose unfulfilled, was almost unbearable. But what could she do against the entrenched attitudes of men like Bart Hollister, who saw education as a frivolity at best and a threat at worst? The morning passed in a blur of lessons. Only 4 students attended Sally, the Cooper twins and young William Harper, whose father worked as the town's blacksmith. Penelope threw herself into the lessons with extra vigor, determined that every minute of learning would count. At midday, she dismissed the children for lunch, promising an afternoon of stories about far-off places. As they scampered out, Penelope sat heavily at her desk, pulling out the ledger where she tracked attendance and progress. The columns of names most crossed out as families had withdrawn their children told the story of her failing mission all too clearly. "Excuse me, Miss Davis." The deep voice startled her. Looking up, she found Knox Lawson standing in the schoolhouse doorway, hat in hand. Today, without the shadow of his hat brim, she could see his features more clearly, the weathered lines around his eyes that spoke of years squinting into sun and distance, the straight nose that had likely been broken at least once, and those startlingly blue eyes that seemed to take in everything. "Mr. Lawson," she acknowledged, quickly closing her ledger. "This is a surprise." "I hope it's not unwelcome," he said, stepping inside but remaining near the door. "I wanted to see the schoolhouse." Penelope gestured around the simple room with its rows of battered desks, the chalkboard she'd purchased with her own savings, and the small bookshelf containing the dozen books she'd brought from Boston. "As you can see, it's hardly impressive." Knox walked further in, examining the children's work posted on the walls, simple sums, carefully printed letters, and drawings of what each child thought the ocean might look like, based on Penelope's descriptions. None of them had ever seen so much water in one place. "On the contrary," Knox said, "I find it very impressive." He pointed to a particularly detailed ocean drawing. "Someone has quite an imagination." "That's Sally's work," Penelope said with pride. "She's never seen the ocean, but she listens so carefully to descriptions." Knox nodded thoughtfully. "I saw the ocean once when I was about her age. My father took me to Galveston before he trailed off, then shook his head slightly. "It was bigger than anything I could have imagined." Penelope sensed there was more to that story, but didn't press. Instead, she asked, "Have you had any luck with your problem-solving?" Knox turned from the children's artwork. "Some. Sheriff Bolton wasn't particularly helpful, but I've picked up a few leads. The stagecoach robber has a particular pattern. He targets coaches carrying mine payrolls, but leaves passengers unmolested. That suggests he has inside information." "You think someone in town is involved?" Knox shrugged. "Possibly, or someone at one of the stage stations." "I'll be asking some questions around town." A thought struck Penelope. "Mr. Hollister is the assayer for the Silver Bell mine. He would know when payrolls are being transported." "Hollister," Knox repeated, recognition flashing in his eyes. "One of the men from yesterday," Penelope nodded. "He's also leading the charge to close the school." The council votes tomorrow, though I've just learned the decision may already be made. Knox frowned. Seems Mr. Hollister and I might need to have another conversation. Please, Penelope said quickly, don't cause trouble on my account. I plan to address the council myself tomorrow evening. I've no doubt you'll make a compelling case, Miss Davis, Knox said with a small smile, but sometimes men like Hollister respond to different kinds of persuasion. Before she could respond, they were interrupted by the return of her students, chattering excitedly as they came through the door. They stopped short at the sight of the tall stranger in their classroom. Children, this is Mr. Lawson, Penelope introduced. He's visiting our school today. The Cooper twins regarded Knox with wide eyes, while William Harper stood a little straighter, clearly impressed by the gun belt visible beneath Knox's open coat. Sally, ever the bold one, stepped forward with a curtsy. Are you a real cowboy, sir? She asked. Knox smiled, kneeling to the child's level. I've been many things, Miss Sally. Cowboy is certainly one of them. Have you been to the ocean? William asked, pointing to the drawings on the wall. I have, Knox confirmed. It's just as grand as your teacher has described, I'm sure. The children peppered him with questions about horses, about gunfights, about distant places. To Penelope's surprise, Knox answered patiently, neither dismissing their curiosity nor embellishing his tales with the kind of exaggerations common among travelers. When he described the vastness of the prairie or the height of mountain passes, he did so with simple eloquence that captivated not only the children but Penelope as well. Mr. Lawson, she said when there was finally a lull in the questions, would you consider telling the children about some of your travels while I prepare for our geography lesson? Knox looked momentarily startled, but then nodded. I suppose I could, though I'm no teacher. Just tell them about somewhere real, she encouraged. Somewhere they might not hear about otherwise. As Knox began describing the red rock formations of Arizona Territory, Penelope busied herself with her maps and books. But she found herself listening more than preparing, drawn in by his descriptions of narrow canyons where ancient peoples had built dwellings in the cliff faces, and desert nights so clear that the stars seemed close enough to touch. By the time the afternoon bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, even the normally restless Cooper twins were hanging on Knox's every word. Penelope was almost reluctant to dismiss the class. Thank you, Mr. Lawson, she said as the children gathered their things. That was quite educational. I'm not sure how educational it was, he replied, but they're good listeners, bright children. They are, Penelope agreed, her voice taking on a hint of fierceness, which makes it all the more criminal that this town would deny them an education. After the children had departed, Sally, with an extra curtsy for their visitor Knox, remained, helping Penelope straighten the desks without being asked. You're good with them, he observed. The children, I mean, they respect you. Children generally do respect those who respect them in return, she replied, erasing the chalkboard. It's the adults who present the challenge, Knox chuckled. That's true enough. He paused, then asked, what will you do if the council closes the school? Penelope set down the eraser, facing the question she'd been avoiding. I suppose I'll have to return to Boston. My father would welcome me home, though he'd be disappointed. He always believed in the importance of bringing education to the frontier. And what do you believe in, Miss Davis? The directness of the question caught her off guard. I believe that knowledge is power, she said after a moment. That every child, regardless of circumstances, deserves the chance to learn. That the future of the West depends not just on gold or silver or cattle, but on minds equipped to solve problems and imagine possibilities. Knox nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Those sound like beliefs worth fighting for. Yes, Penelope agreed quietly. They are. They finished tidying the classroom in comfortable silence. As they stepped outside, Penelope locked the schoolhouse door, wondering if tomorrow would be the last time she would do so. May I walk you home again, Miss Davis? Knox asked. Thank you, but I need to stop at Mercer's store first, she replied. Mrs. Mercer ordered some paper and pencils for me weeks ago, and I should check if they've arrived, though I suppose it hardly matters now. I'll accompany you, Knox said, falling into step beside her. I need supplies myself. As they walked through town, Penelope was again aware of the stares, but they seemed different today, curious rather than derisive. Word had clearly spread about Knox's confrontation with Hollister and his men. "People are watching us," she murmured. "Let them," Knox replied simply. "A man and a woman walking down a street shouldn't be cause for gossip." "Everything is cause for gossip in a town like Primrose Gulch," Penelope said with a small smile, "particularly when it involves the fancy Eastern schoolmarm and a mysterious stranger." Knox laughed, a warm sound that drew even more attention. "Is that what they call you? Fancy? In that sensible dress and practical boots?" Penelope glanced down at her well-worn outfit. "I arrived in clothes better suited to Boston than a mining town," she admitted. "I've adapted since then, but first impressions tend to linger." "That they do," Knox agreed, his expression suggesting he knew something about that particular truth. At Mercer's general store, they found Mrs. Mercer behind the counter, her normally sour expression brightening at the sight of customers. "Miss Davis and Mr. Lawson, isn't it? What can I help you with today?" "I came to inquire about the school supplies I ordered," Penelope said. "Have they arrived, Mrs.?" Mercer's smile faltered slightly. "They have, dear, but, well, given what my husband told me about the council's decision, I wasn't sure if you'd still want them." Penelope straightened her spine. "The vote isn't until tomorrow evening, Mrs. Mercer. Until then, I'm still the teacher, and my students still need supplies." Mrs. Mercer looked uncomfortable but nodded, disappearing into the back room. Knox, meanwhile, examined the store's offerings, selecting coffee, tobacco, and ammunition with the efficiency of someone accustomed to traveling light. "Does your husband typically share council business before it's officially decided?" Knox asked casually when Mrs. Mercer returned with a small package for Penelope. The woman flushed. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Mr. Lawson. Gerald simply mentioned that there's been some discussion about the school's future." "I see," Knox said, placing his selections on the counter. "It's just that Miss Davis mentioned the vote is tomorrow, yet it sounds like minds are already made up." Mrs. Mercer busied herself with tallying his purchases. "The council members are entitled to their opinions, sir." "Of course they are," Knox agreed pleasantly. "I'm just curious about how a town decides something isn't worth investing in before properly evaluating its value." Mrs. Mercer looked up sharply. "The school has been open for 6 months, Mr. Lawson. Attendance has dwindled to almost nothing. How much more evaluation is needed?" Penelope felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but before she could respond, Knox continued in that same conversational tone. "I wonder if the council has considered why attendance has dwindled. In my experience, people generally recognize value when they see it. Miss Davis is clearly a capable teacher. So what's discouraging parents from sending their children to school?" Mrs. Mercer's lips thinned. "Perhaps you should attend the council meeting tomorrow if you're so interested in local affairs, Mr. Lawson. That will be $1.75 for your supplies." Knox placed the money on the counter, gathering his purchases. "Perhaps I will, Mrs. Mercer. Good day to you." Outside, Penelope clutched her small package of school supplies, mortification still coloring her cheeks. "You shouldn't have done that," she said quietly as they walked away from the store. "Mrs. Mercer will tell her husband, and that's another council vote firmly against the school." "Was her husband's vote ever in question?" Knox asked. Penelope sighed. "No, I suppose not." They walked in silence until they reached Penelope's small lodging behind the store. At the door, she turned to thank him for the escort, but Knox spoke first. "What time is the council meeting tomorrow?" 7 o'clock, Penelope replied. "But Mr. Lawson, I appreciate your concern, truly I do, but this isn't your fight." Knox studied her for a moment, those blue eyes unnervingly direct. "Sometimes the most important fights find us, Miss Davis, rather than the other way around." With that cryptic statement, he tipped his hat and departed, leaving Penelope wondering what exactly he meant and why the thought of seeing him at tomorrow's meeting gave her such conflicting feelings of hope and dread. The next day passed in a haze of nervous anticipation. Only Sally and William attended school, the Cooper twins having been kept home by their mother, who had heard about the impending closure. Penelope did her best to keep the lessons engaging, but her mind repeatedly drifted to the evening's council meeting. As dusk approached, she changed into her best dress, a forest green that her father had insisted she bring to make a proper impression when needed. With trembling fingers, she pinned her hair in a more formal style and practiced her arguments in the small mirror. "Gentlemen of the council," she rehearsed, "the future of Primrose Gulch depends not just on what we pull from the earth, but on the minds we cultivate. Every great civilization has understood that education is the foundation of progress." The words sounded hollow even to her own ears. These were not men who cared about great civilizations. They cared about profit, about maintaining the status quo, about not wasting money on children who were destined for lives in the mines or the laundry or the saloon. With a sigh, Penelope gathered her ledger and the carefully prepared statement she'd written out. Facts and figures might sway them more than appeals to higher principles. She would show them the progress her students had made, the potential being wasted. The town hall was actually just the larger back room of the saloon, separated by folding doors that did little to block the noise from the bar. As Penelope entered, conversation temporarily halted, then resumed at a lower volume. She recognized most of the faces' parents who had withdrawn their children from school, merchants who had been initially welcoming but gradually cooler as the town's sentiment turned against her, miners who had never shown anything but scorn for her presence. The council members sat at a long table at the front of the room, 5 men representing the various interests of Primrose Gulch. Mayor Fletcher, a former prospector who'd struck it moderately rich and now owned several buildings in town; Gerald Mercer, whose general store was the lifeblood of local commerce; Bart Hollister, the mine assayer with his perpetual sneer; Reverend Thomas, who preached fire and brimstone on Sundays and spent the rest of the week as silent as his nearly empty church; and finally, Dr. Wilson, the town's physician, who at least had always been professionally courteous to Penelope. Penelope took a seat near the front, ignoring the whispers that followed her. She searched the crowd for Knox but didn't see him among the faces. A small, irrational disappointment settled in her chest. Mayor Fletcher called the meeting to order with a rap of his gavel. "First order of business is the matter of the school," he announced, dispensing with any preliminaries. "As you all know, we agreed to a 6-month trial period for Miss Davis's educational endeavor. That period is now concluded, and the council must decide whether to continue funding the school through the winter." He looked at Penelope. "Miss Davis, I understand you wish to address the council on this matter." Penelope rose, clutching her notes. "Yes, Mayor Fletcher." "Thank you for the opportunity." She began with her prepared statement, outlining the progress made by her students, how Sally Jenkins could now read at a level 3 years beyond her age, how William Harper had shown remarkable aptitude for mathematics, how the Cooper twins had learned more history in 6 months than many adults would know in a lifetime. "These children are the future of Primrose Gulch," she concluded, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "They deserve the chance to build lives beyond what we can currently imagine. Education is that chance." When she finished, there was a moment of silence. Then Bart Hollister leaned forward, his expression contemptuous. "Very pretty words, Miss Davis, but the fact remains that you've got, 4 students, 5 on a good day. The town is paying for a schoolhouse, your salary, supplies all for a handful of children whose parents could just as easily teach them their letters at home if they thought it so important." "Not all parents have the education to teach their children," Penelope countered. "And many are working too hard just to put food on the table." "Exactly my point," Hollister said with a satisfied smile. "They're focused on practical matters. Reading fancy books isn't going to put food on anyone's table." "With respect, Mr. Hollister," came a deep voice from the back of the room, "that's short-sighted thinking." Heads turned as Knox Lawson made his way forward, his presence commanding attention without effort. He had cleaned up for the occasion. Penelope noticed his clothes were dust-free, his hair neatly combed, though he still wore his gun belt. "Mr. Lawson," Mayor Fletcher acknowledged with a frown, "this is a town matter. You're a visitor here." "That I am," Knox agreed, coming to stand near Penelope. A visitor who's seen what education or the lack of it can do to communities across this territory. Hollister's eyes narrowed. And I suppose you're an expert on community building, are you? A drifter with a gun. I've been in enough places to recognize a town at a crossroads, Knox replied calmly. Primrose Gulch has a decision to make about what kind of future it wants. The mines are the future of this town, Hollister shot back. Always have been. Mines play out, Knox said simply. I've seen it happen. Ghost towns litter these mountains, places that were once bustling, now empty because they put all their hopes in what lay underground and none in what stood above it. A murmur ran through the crowd. Penelope realized that Knox had touched on an unspoken fear that the Silver Bell mine, like so many others, might one day run dry. Dr. Wilson leaned forward. You make an interesting point, Mr. Lawson, but how does keeping the school open protect against that eventuality? Education gives options, Knox answered. Children who can read, write, and cipher have choices beyond following their parents into the mines or the laundry. They can become merchants, engineers, doctors. They can help the town evolve beyond a single industry. Penelope stared at Knox, surprised and moved by his eloquent defense. This was a side of him she hadn't fully glimpsed before, a man who clearly understood more about the world and its workings than his rough exterior might suggest. Reverend Thomas, who had remained silent until now, cleared his throat. There's something to be said for tradition, for children following in their parents' footsteps. Too much education can lead young minds astray. With respect, Reverend, Penelope interjected, finding her voice again. Education doesn't replace tradition, it enriches it. Children who can read can study the Bible for themselves, can better understand the wisdom of their elders, can preserve stories that might otherwise be lost. The Reverend looked thoughtful at this, but Hollister was unmoved. Fine words don't change facts, he insisted. The school is a drain on town resources that could be better spent elsewhere. Such as, Knox challenged. Hollister's face reddened. That's not the point. The point is, the council has already what, Mr. Hollister? Mayor Fletcher interrupted, looking uncomfortable. The council hasn't voted yet. An awkward silence fell. Penelope realized that Hollister had nearly admitted what Mrs. Jenkins had warned her about, that the decision had been made before the meeting. Knox seemed to sense the tension. Perhaps before voting, the council might consider hearing from parents, he suggested. After all, they're the ones most affected by this decision. Mayor Fletcher hesitated, then nodded. That seems reasonable. Are there any parents present who wish to speak on this matter? To Penelope's surprise, several hands went up. Mrs. Jenkins was the first to speak, her voice quavering with nervousness, but gaining strength as she described how Sally's reading had improved both her daughter's prospects and her own life, as Sally now read labels and notices to her illiterate mother. William Harper's father spoke next, a burly blacksmith with hands like anvils and a soft spot for his only son. My boy won't be swinging a hammer all his life if I can help it, he declared. Miss Davis has shown him there's more to the world than our little corner of it. One by one, parents stood to speak, not just those whose children still attended school, but some who had withdrawn their children due to community pressure or practical concerns. They spoke of mixed feelings, of weighing immediate needs against future possibilities, of the hope that education represented. As the testimonies continued, Penelope felt a lump forming in her throat. She hadn't realized how many people quietly supported her work, even if they hadn't been able to act on that support. Finally, Mayor Fletcher called for the vote. Gerald Mercer, perhaps influenced by the unexpected show of community interest, voted to keep the school open. Dr. Wilson did the same. Reverend Thomas hesitated, then also voted in favor, murmuring something about Bible study. Bart Hollister, unsurprisingly, voted to close the school. That left Mayor Fletcher as the deciding vote. The room held its collective breath as he deliberated. I came to this territory with nothing but the clothes on my back and a pickaxe, Fletcher finally said. Made my fortune through hard work, not book learning. He paused, his weathered face inscrutable. But times change. The world gets more complicated every year. Maybe our children need more than we had. He nodded once, decisively. The school stays open. A cheer erupted from the crowd. Penelope found herself enveloped in a hug from Sally Jenkins, the child having apparently snuck into the meeting against her mother's wishes. Over the girl's head, Penelope's eyes met Knox's. The smile they shared felt like a private victory celebration amidst the public one. As the meeting adjourned and people began to disperse, Hollister pushed his way through the crowd toward Knox, his face flushed with anger. "You've got no right interfering in town business," he snarled, standing too close. "You don't belong here, and neither does she." Knox didn't back away, but neither did he respond with matching hostility. "The town just voted, Mr. Hollister. Seems they disagree with you on both counts." Hollister's hand twitched near his hip, where Penelope now noticed he wore a pistol. "You think you're clever, don't you? Coming in here stirring up trouble. I know your type drifters who think a gun makes them important." "And I know your type," Knox replied, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "Men who mistake bullying for strength." For a moment, Penelope feared the confrontation would escalate further, but Sheriff Bolton, who had observed the meeting from the back, finally stepped forward. "That's enough, Hollister," he said wearily. "Council's voted. Go home." With a final glare at Knox, Hollister stalked away, shouldering roughly past anyone in his path. "Thank you," Penelope said to Knox when they finally had a moment alone. "I don't know how to repay you for what you did tonight." Knox shook his head. "I didn't do much. The town made the right choice, they just needed to hear all sides before deciding." Penelope wasn't convinced that was all there was to it, but she didn't argue. "May I buy you a cup of coffee, Mrs. Harper mentioned she's serving some at the blacksmith's to celebrate." Knox hesitated, then nodded. "I'd like that, Miss Davis." As they walked together toward the blacksmith's shop, where a small crowd was already gathering, Penelope felt a lightness she hadn't experienced since arriving in Primrose Gulch. For the first time, she felt not just tolerated but genuinely welcomed by at least part of the community. And walking beside Knox Lawson, she felt something else too, a warmth that had nothing to do with community acceptance and everything to do with the man himself. The celebration at the blacksmith shop was modest but heartfelt. Mrs. Harper had prepared coffee and simple cakes, and the small gathering of parents and supporters filled the normally sooty workspace with conversation and laughter. Penelope found herself the center of attention in a way she hadn't experienced before, not as an object of ridicule, but as someone valued. Knox remained at her side for much of the evening, a quiet presence that somehow anchored her amidst the swirl of congratulations and newfound goodwill. She noticed how he observed everything, missing nothing, the way Sheriff Bolton kept glancing toward the door, the way Dr. Wilson's wife seemed to know everyone's business, the way the children gravitated toward the corner where William Harper was showing off his father's tools. "You see a lot, don't you?" she murmured to Knox during a lull in conversation. He looked down at her, those blue eyes crinkling slightly at the corners. "Habit," he replied. "In my line of work, details matter." "And what exactly is your work, Mr. Lawson?" she pressed gently. "Beyond problem solving, I mean." Knox seemed to consider his answer carefully. "I track things in people that others can't or won't find, sometimes for the law, sometimes for private citizens. A bounty hunter with principles," Penelope observed, that earned her a genuine smile. "I like to think so, though others might disagree. And what brought you to Primrose Gulch?" "You mentioned stagecoach robberies." Knox nodded, lowering his voice. "A series of them between here and Denver. Always payroll shipments, never passenger valuables. It suggests someone with specific information about what's being transported when." "Like an assayer who would know when mine payrolls are being shipped," Penelope suggested, thinking of Hollister's evident dislike for Knox. "Perhaps," Knox agreed, "but I don't have proof yet." Their conversation was interrupted by Sally Jenkins, who tugged at Penelope's sleeve with childish impatience. "Miss Davis, will we have a special lesson tomorrow to celebrate?" the girl asked hopefully. Penelope smiled down at her eager student. "I think that's an excellent idea, Sally. Perhaps we could all write stories about what we want to be when we grow up." "I want to be a teacher like you," Sally declared, then turned to Knox. "Mr. Lawson, will you visit our class again? Your stories about the desert were ever so exciting." Knox looked momentarily caught off guard by the child's enthusiasm. I don't know if I'll be in town much longer, Miss Sally. I have work to do. Oh, Sally's face fell dramatically, as only a child's can. But you helped save our school. You should see how it works now that it's saved. Penelope couldn't help but laugh at the girl's logic. Sally, Mr. Lawson has important business to attend to. We shouldn't impose on his time. It wouldn't be an imposition, Knox said, surprising both of them. I could stop by tomorrow afternoon, if that would be acceptable, Miss Davis. Of course, Penelope replied, trying to ignore the flutter in her chest at the prospect. The children would enjoy that very much. Sally beamed triumphantly and scampered off to share the news with William. You don't have to humor her, Penelope said once the child was out of earshot. I know you must be busy with your investigation. I meant what I said, Knox assured her. Besides, spending time at the school might give me a better sense of the town dynamics. You'd be surprised what children notice about their parents and neighbors. Penelope raised an eyebrow. Are you planning to interrogate my students, Mr. Lawson? Nothing so formal, he replied with a chuckle. Just keeping my eyes and ears open. As the evening wore on, people gradually departed until only a small group remained. Penelope, mindful of the early morning ahead, reluctantly decided it was time to leave. May I walk you home, Miss Davis? Knox asked, retrieving her shawl from the hook by the door. I'd appreciate that, she replied, suddenly aware of how dark the streets of Primrose Gulch would be at this hour. They bid farewell to the Harpers and stepped out into the cool night air. Stars blazed overhead in the clear mountain sky, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its kin. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, their path lit by the occasional lamp from a window and the generous moonlight. Penelope found herself acutely aware of Knox beside her, the solid presence of him, the faint scent of leather and tobacco that seemed to cling to his clothes. Thank you again for your help tonight, she said finally. I don't think the vote would have gone my way without your intervention. You give me too much credit, Knox replied. Your work speaks for itself. The parents who stood up tonight, they did that because they've seen the difference you're making. Perhaps, Penelope conceded. But having someone like you speak in support of education, it carries weight with men who might dismiss a woman's perspective. Knox frowned slightly. That shouldn't be the case. No, Penelope agreed. It shouldn't. But we both know the world as it is, not as it should be. They reached her small lodging behind Mercer's store. Penelope turned to bid him good night, but found him looking intently at the building, his expression suddenly alert. What is it? She asked. The door, he said quietly. It's ajar. Penelope looked and saw he was right. The door to her room stood slightly open when she was certain she had locked it before leaving for the council meeting. Knox's hand moved to rest near his holstered pistol. Stay here, he instructed, his voice taking on a harder edge than she'd heard before. But please, Penelope, he said, using her given name for the first time. The urgency in his tone silenced her protest. She watched as he approached the door cautiously, drawing his weapon before pushing it fully open with his foot. After a tense moment, he disappeared inside. Penelope held her breath, straining to hear any sound from within. When Knox reappeared in the doorway a minute later, his expression was grim. Someone's been through your things, he said. Nothing seems to be missing, but they certainly made a mess. Penelope hurried forward, brushing past him to see for herself. Her small sitting room had indeed been ransacked, books pulled from shelves, her desk drawers appended, papers scattered across the floor. She moved quickly to the adjacent bedroom and found similar disarray, her clothes chest open, garments tossed about, her mattress askew. Why would anyone do this? She asked, dismay giving way to anger. I have nothing of value. Knox holstered his weapon but remained vigilant, examining the scene with professional attention. This wasn't a robbery, he said. This was someone looking for something specific. What could I possibly have that anyone would want? Knox shook his head. I don't know, but the timing is interesting. The same night as the council vote. Have you received any threats, letters, warnings? No, nothing like that, Penelope insisted, then hesitated. Although there was an incident last month. Someone threw rocks at the schoolhouse windows while I was teaching. Sheriff Bolton dismissed it as children's mischief. Children don't break into homes and search them methodically, Knox observed grimly. Penelope sank onto the edge of her disheveled bed, the events of the evening catching up with her. The elation of the council vote now seemed distant, overshadowed by this violation of her private space. "You shouldn't stay here tonight," Knox said, his tone brooking no argument. "Whoever did this might return." "Where would I go?" Penelope asked. "It's late and I can hardly impose on one of the families," Knox considered for a moment. "The hotel has vacant rooms, I've taken one myself." Penelope felt heat rise to her cheeks at the implication. "Mr. Lawson, I couldn't possibly separate rooms," he clarified quickly. "Of course, but the hotel is secure and I'd be nearby if there's trouble." She wanted to protest further, to insist she wasn't some helpless woman who needed protection. But the practical reality of her situation was undeniable. Someone had broken into her home, possibly with malicious intent, and staying alone would be foolish. "Very well," she agreed reluctantly. "Let me gather some essentials for the night," Knox nodded. "I'll wait outside." "Take only what you need for tomorrow. We can come back in daylight to properly assess the damage." As he stepped outside to give her privacy, Penelope moved mechanically around the disarrayed room, collecting a fresh dress, her hairbrush, and a few other necessities. Her mind raced with questions: who would do this, and why? Was it related to the school, to her position in the town? Or was it, as Knox seemed to suspect, connected to something else entirely? When she emerged with a small bundle of belongings, she found Knox standing guard, his posture alert but outwardly calm. Without a word, he offered his arm, and she took it, grateful for the steady support as they made their way toward the town's small hotel. The night clerk raised his eyebrows at their arrival but asked no questions, as Knox requested a room for the schoolteacher, whose lodgings have been compromised. Money changed hands, and soon Penelope found herself being escorted to a small but clean room on the hotel's second floor. "My room is just there," Knox said, indicating a door across the narrow hallway. "Lock your door, and if you hear anything suspicious, anything at all, call out." Penelope nodded, suddenly exhausted. "Thank you, Mr. Lawson, for everything." "Knox," he corrected gently. "I think we're well past formalities at this point." "Knox," she repeated, the name feeling strangely intimate on her lips. "And you should call me Penelope." He smiled, the expression softening his weathered features. "Good night, Penelope. Try to rest. Tomorrow we'll get some answers." As she closed the door and turned the key in the lock, Penelope wondered what answers tomorrow might bring and whether she was ready for them. Morning brought clarity of a sort. In the light of day, Penelope could see that while her lodgings had been thoroughly searched, nothing had been damaged beyond repair. With Knox's help, she restored order to the rooms, putting books back on shelves and clothes back in drawers. Any idea what they might have been looking for? Knox asked as they worked. Penelope shook her head. "I keep thinking about it, but I can't imagine. My personal correspondence, my teaching materials, none of it seems worth this effort." "Sometimes people aren't rational about what they value," Knox observed, carefully righting her desk. "Or they believe something exists that doesn't." As they finished the cleanup, Sheriff Bolton finally arrived, having been informed of the break-in by the hotel clerk. His inspection of the premises was cursory at best, probably just vandalism, he concluded with a dismissive wave. "Some folks weren't happy about the council vote. They'll settle down now that it's done." "This wasn't random vandalism," Knox insisted. "Someone was searching for something specific." Bolton regarded Knox with barely concealed dislike. "And how would you know that, Lawson?" "Got experience with break-ins, do you?" "I have experience recognizing the difference between destruction for its own sake and a methodical search," Knox replied evenly. The sheriff snorted. "Well, I don't see anything worth stealing here, no offense, Miss Davis." "And nothing's actually missing, right?" "Not that I can tell," Penelope admitted. "There you have it then," Bolton said with finality. "Just someone letting off steam. I'll keep an extra eye on your place for a few days, but I wouldn't worry too much." After the sheriff left, Penelope turned to Knox with a frown. He didn't take this seriously at all. "No," Knox agreed, his expression thoughtful. "He didn't." "You think he knows something about it?" Knox chose his words carefully. I think Sheriff Bolton isn't particularly interested in solving certain types of problems in this town. Penelope gathered the last of her belongings from the hotel room and prepared to return to her usual routine. Despite the disruption, she was determined to keep the day as normal as possible for her students. "Will you still come by the school this afternoon?" she asked Knox as they parted ways outside her lodgings. "I'll be there," he promised. "In the meantime, keep your doors locked and be aware of your surroundings." The school day passed in a blur of excitement. News of the council vote and the break-in at Miss Davis's home had spread through town with typical small community speed. Attendance was up. Besides her regular students, 2 children who had previously been withdrawn returned, along with one new face, a shy girl named Emma, whose father worked as a clerk at the assayer's office. Penelope threw herself into teaching with renewed enthusiasm, the violated feeling from the break-in gradually receding as she lost herself in the familiar rhythms of the classroom. When Knox arrived in the afternoon, she was in the midst of a geography lesson, using a crude map she'd drawn to show the children the vastness of the American West. "Mr. Lawson," Sally exclaimed, spotting him first, "you came back." The other children turned to stare at the tall figure in the doorway, some with open curiosity, others with the wariness that frontier children often developed early. "I promised I would," Knox said, removing his hat as he entered. "I hope I'm not interrupting your lesson, Miss Davis." "Not at all," Penelope replied, feeling an unexpected flutter at his presence. "We were just discussing the different territories and states. Perhaps you could tell the children about some of the places you've visited." For the next hour, Knox captivated the class with descriptions of the territories he'd traveled through: the endless grasslands of Kansas, the rugged mountains of Montana, the red deserts of Arizona. He had a gift for storytelling, painting pictures with words that made these distant places seem vivid and real to children who had never ventured beyond their small valley. "Have you ever been to California, Mr. Lawson?" Emma, the new girl, asked timidly. "Pa says there's an ocean there bigger than anyone can imagine." "I have," Knox confirmed. "The Pacific Ocean is indeed enormous, so big that you can stand on the shore and see nothing but water all the way to the horizon." "Is it scary?" William Harper wanted to know. Knox considered the question seriously. "It can be. The ocean demands respect, but it's beautiful too, always changing, never quite the same from one moment to the next." As the children peppered him with more questions, Penelope observed the interaction with growing admiration. Knox treated each question with respect, never talking down to the children or dismissing their curiosity. It was a quality she valued highly and rarely found in the men of Primrose Gulch. When the school day ended, the children departed reluctantly, extracting a promise from Knox that he would visit again soon. As the last student left, Penelope found herself alone with Knox in the quiet schoolhouse. "You're very good with them," she said, gathering her teaching materials. "Have you worked with children before?" "Not formally," Knox replied, helping her erase the chalkboard. "But I was the oldest of 5, so I had some practice answering endless questions." Penelope smiled at the image of a young Knox patiently explaining the world to younger siblings. "5 children, your mother must have been busy." "She was," he agreed, a shadow crossing his features. "She died when I was 15. Fever took her." "I'm sorry," Penelope said softly. "My mother passed when I was 12. It's not easy losing a parent so young." Knox nodded, a moment of shared understanding passing between them. "What about your father? You mentioned he's in Boston." "Yes, he's a professor at Harvard, literature." Penelope smiled fondly. "He wasn't thrilled about my coming west, but he understood my reasons." "He's always believed in following one's convictions." "And what convinced you to come to Primrose Gulch specifically?" Knox asked, setting down the eraser. Penelope hesitated, then decided on honesty. "A letter from the previous schoolteacher, Martha Williams. She wrote to my father's department seeking someone to replace her. She was returning east for family reasons and worried the school would close without a successor." Knox frowned slightly. "Did you ever meet her?" "No," Penelope admitted. "By the time I arrived, she had already left. The mayor gave me her teaching materials and the key to the schoolhouse." And no one in town talks about her much. Penelope considered this. Now that you mention it, no. When I've asked, people just say she was quiet or kept to herself. Why do you ask? Knox shrugged, but she sensed there was more behind the question than casual curiosity. Just trying to understand the town dynamics. It's unusual for a community to be so divided over education. As they finished tidying the classroom, Knox offered to walk Penelope home again. The afternoon was pleasant, with the aspens along the creek beginning to show hints of gold among their green leaves. Fall would come early to these mountains, Penelope knew, and with it, the harsh winter that would test the town's commitment to keeping the school open. "Do you think there will be more trouble?" she asked as they walked. "About the school, I mean." Knox's expression grew serious. "Possibly. Hollister didn't seem like the type to accept defeat gracefully. He's always been opposed to the school," Penelope mused. "From the very beginning, even before attendance started dropping. I never understood why he cares so much. Men like that often fear what they don't control," Knox observed. "Education changes people, gives them ideas and ambitions beyond what others might want for them." They had reached Penelope's lodgings, which looked peaceful enough in the afternoon light. Still, Knox insisted on checking inside before leaving her. "All clear," he reported after a quick inspection, "but I'd still feel better if you kept your doors locked, especially at night." "I will," Penelope promised. "Where will you be if I need to find you?" "Still at the hotel," Knox replied. "I have some inquiries to make around town, but I won't be far." An awkward moment followed, neither quite ready to say goodbye but with no clear reason to prolong the encounter. Finally, Penelope gathered her courage. "Would you? That is, if you're not otherwise engaged, would you consider having dinner with me tomorrow evening?" The invitation tumbled out in a rush. "As a thank you for all your help." Knox looked surprised, then pleased. "I'd like that very much, Penelope." "Good," she said, relieved. 6 o'clock. I'm not much of a cook, I'm afraid, but I can manage something decent." 6 it is," he agreed with a smile that transformed his weathered face. "Until tomorrow, then." As Knox departed, tipping his hat in farewell, Penelope closed her door and leaned against it, her heart beating a little faster than usual. She told herself it was merely the lingering anxiety from the break-in, or perhaps relief at the school remaining open. But even she didn't quite believe that explanation. The next day at school, Penelope found herself distracted, her thoughts repeatedly drifting to the evening ahead. She had invited Knox to dinner on impulse, driven by gratitude and a desire to learn more about the mysterious man who had so unexpectedly become her ally. But as the day progressed, she realized the invitation felt increasingly like something else, something that made her both nervous and eager in ways that had nothing to do with simple gratitude. When the final bell rang and the children departed, she hurried back to her lodgings to prepare. The small kitchen area at the back of her rooms was rarely used for more than making tea or simple breakfasts, but tonight she was determined to create a proper meal. She had purchased chicken from the butcher, along with fresh vegetables from Mrs. Jenkins, who kept a small garden behind her laundry. It wasn't much, but with careful preparation and the cooking skills her father's housekeeper had insisted she learn before heading west, Penelope thought she could produce something palatable. As she worked, she found herself wondering about Knox Lawson. He was unlike any man she had known in Boston, neither the bookish academics of her father's circle, nor the polished, ambitious young men who had occasionally called on her there. Knox carried himself with a quiet confidence that needed no validation, spoke thoughtfully but directly, and treated everyone from children to elders with the same forthright respect. And then there were his eyes, that startling blue that seemed to see more than most, to look past surfaces to what lay beneath. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. It was exactly 6 o'clock. Taking a deep breath to calm her suddenly fluttering nerves, Penelope smoothed her dress, the forest green one again, her best, and went to answer. Knox stood on her doorstep, hat in hand, looking somewhat different than usual. He had clearly made an effort for the occasion. His clothes were freshly brushed, his hair neatly combed, and he had shaved the stubble that usually shadowed his jaw. "Good evening," he said, and Penelope was oddly pleased to detect a hint of nervousness in his usually composed demeanor. "Good evening," she replied, stepping back to allow him entry. "Please come in." Knox handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper. "It's not much," he said, "but I thought you might enjoy it." Curious, Penelope unwrapped the gift to find a book, a collection of poetry by Walt Whitman. The volume was clearly not new, its binding softened with use, but it had been cared for. "It's lovely," she said, genuinely touched. "Do you enjoy Whitman's work?" "I do," Knox admitted. "His words capture something essential about this country, its vastness, its contradictions, its possibilities." Penelope ran her fingers over the embossed cover. "Thank you. This is a thoughtful gift." The dinner that followed was simple but pleasant. They sat at Penelope's small table, talking easily about literature, about the West, about their different experiences of the same vast country. Knox, she discovered, was widely read despite his lack of formal education, a self-taught man whose curiosity had led him to books whenever he could find them. "My father would like you," she observed as they finished the meal. "He always says the best students are those who choose learning for themselves." "I'm not sure a Harvard professor would find much to approve of in a bounty hunter," Knox replied with a wry smile. "You underestimate him," Penelope countered. "And yourself. Besides, you're more than your profession." A comfortable silence fell between them. Outside, the last light of day was fading, painting Penelope's simple curtains with golden hues. "May I ask you something personal?" she ventured after a moment. Knox nodded, his expression open. "Of course. How did you come to your current line of work? It seems an unusual choice for someone with your thoughtfulness." He considered the question, clearly deciding how much to share. "After my mother died, my father wasn't equipped to handle 5 children. He tried, but he sought solace in whiskey more often than not. By the time I was 17, I was essentially raising my siblings." He paused, his gaze distant. "When my sister Margaret took ill the same fever that took our mother, I needed money for medicine. A local rancher offered $20 to anyone who could track down a mountain lion that had been killing his calves. I'd always been good at tracking, at reading signs others missed, so I did it. And that led to tracking people instead of animals," Knox nodded. "One thing led to another. The sheriff needed help finding a rustler. Then a banker asked me to locate a man who disappeared with a significant sum. I discovered I had a knack for finding people who didn't want to be found. It must be dangerous work," Penelope observed. "It can be," Knox acknowledged, "but I have rules. I don't take contracts on women or children, regardless of the alleged offense. I don't bring in anyone to face mob justice. And I try to ensure those I track get a fair hearing, even if that means advocating for them myself." Penelope studied him in the fading light, seeing the complex man behind the stoic exterior. "Your parents would be proud of the man you've become," she said softly. "I hope so," Knox replied, his voice equally soft. "Now, may I ask you something in return, of course? What really brought you to Primrose Gulch? There must have been more established towns looking for teachers, places where you wouldn't face such resistance." Penelope smiled wistfully. "There were, but when I read Martha Williams's letter, something about it spoke to me. She wrote about the children here, about their potential, their hunger for knowledge despite the hardships of frontier life. She believed this town could be more than just another mining camp that would vanish when the silver ran out. And you believed that too." "I did." "I still do," Penelope said firmly. "Even with all the challenges, I've seen what education can mean to children like Sally and William, how it gives them a future beyond what's expected of them." Knox nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's worth fighting for." "Yes," Penelope agreed, "it is." As they cleared the dishes together, working side by side in the small kitchen area, Penelope was struck by how natural it felt, this domestic scene with a man she had known for just days, but who already seemed to understand her better than people she'd known for years. "Thank you for dinner," Knox said as they finished. "It's been a long time since I've enjoyed a home-cooked meal and good conversation." "Thank you for the company," Penelope replied, "and for the book, I'll treasure it." An awkward moment followed, both of them sensing the evening drawing to a close but neither quite ready for it to end. Knox glanced toward the window where darkness had fully fallen. "It's getting late," he observed reluctantly. "I should let you rest." Penelope nodded, equally reluctant. "Will I see you tomorrow, if you'd like?" Knox said, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I'd planned to ask around town about those stagecoach robberies, but I could stop by the school afterward." "I'd like that," Penelope said simply. At the door, Knox paused, turning back to face her. For a moment, Penelope thought perhaps hoped that he might kiss her. Instead, he took her hand gently in his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "Good night, Penelope," he said softly, and the way he said her name felt more intimate than any kiss could have been. "Good night, Knox," she replied, and watched as he walked away into the darkness, his figure silhouetted against the distant lights of the saloon. Closing the door, Penelope leaned against it, her hand still warm from his touch, her heart beating a rapid rhythm that had nothing to do with fear or anxiety and everything to do with the realization that she was falling for Knox Lawson, a man who, by his own admission, never stayed in one place for long. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, with the first real hint of autumn in the air. Penelope rose early, her mind still replaying moments from the previous evening. Knox's smile in the candlelight, the warmth in his eyes when he spoke of Whitman's poetry, the gentle pressure of his hand on hers as they said good night. She was so distracted that she nearly missed the envelope that had been slipped under her door sometime during the night. It was plain, with no name or address written on it. Opening it with curious fingers, she found a single sheet of paper inside, its message brief and chilling. "Leave Primrose Gulch by week's end or we'll close your school permanently." Penelope stared at the note, her hands trembling slightly. The threat was clear enough, but who had sent it? Bart Hollister seemed the obvious suspect, given his vocal opposition to the school, but something about the note suggested a deeper, more organized hostility than one man's grudge. She briefly considered taking the note to Sheriff Bolton, but his dismissive attitude toward the break-in made her doubt he would take this threat seriously either. That left Knox. She would show him the note when he came by the school that afternoon. Despite her unsettled feelings, Penelope was determined not to let the threat disrupt her teaching. She arrived at the schoolhouse early, as was her habit, and found an unexpected sight: William Harper's father, and another man she recognized as one of the miners who had spoken in support of the school at the council meeting, were installing heavy shutters on the schoolhouse windows. "Morning, Miss Davis," Mr. Harper greeted her. "Thought these might be a good idea, what with the break-in at your place and all. Can't be too careful." "That's very kind, Mr. Harper," Penelope said, touched by the gesture, "but I can't afford to pay for such improvements right now." The blacksmith waved off her concern. "No charge. Consider it a thank you for what you're doing for our children." As the men worked, Penelope prepared for the day's lessons, the threatening note tucked securely in her pocket. She wouldn't let fear drive her away from Primrose Gulch or the children who needed her. If someone wanted her gone, they would have to do more than send anonymous threats. The school day passed without incident, and Penelope gradually relaxed into the familiar rhythm of teaching. Attendance had increased again. 9 children now filled the small classroom, their eager faces giving her renewed determination to continue her work regardless of opposition. When Knox arrived in the late afternoon, the children were working on compositions about what they wanted to be when they grew up, an exercise inspired by Sally's declaration that she wanted to be a teacher. Knox slipped in quietly, taking a seat at the back of the room to observe without interrupting. Penelope felt his presence immediately, like a current in the air. She continued the lesson, listening as each child read their composition aloud. William wanted to be an engineer who built bridges and railroads. The Cooper twins couldn't decide between being lawmen or ranchers. Emma, the assayer's daughter, surprised everyone by declaring she wanted to be a doctor. "Pa says girls can't be doctors," she said defiantly, "but Miss Davis showed us in a book about a lady doctor in New York, so I know it's possible." Penelope's heart swelled with pride. This was why she taught to show children possibilities beyond the narrow confines of what they were told they could be. As the final bell rang and the children gathered their things, Penelope caught Knox's eye across the room. The warmth in his gaze made her momentarily forget the threatening note in her pocket. "Thank you for coming," she said once the last student had departed. "I'm glad I did," Knox replied, moving to help her straighten the desks. "It's encouraging to see the increased attendance." "Yes, it seems the council vote has changed some minds," Penelope agreed. "Or at least made some parents brave enough to send their children despite community pressure." As they worked, Penelope hesitated, then pulled the anonymous note from her pocket. "I found this under my door this morning," she said, handing it to Knox, his expression darkened as he read the brief message. "Have you shown this to Sheriff Bolton?" Penelope shook her head. "After his reaction to the break-in, I didn't think he'd take it seriously." "You're probably right," Knox agreed grimly, examining the paper carefully. "No handwriting to identify common paper that could have come from anywhere in town." He looked up at her. "This concerns me, Penelope. Coming after the break-in, it suggests someone is escalating their opposition to your presence here." "I won't be intimidated," Penelope said firmly. "I've committed to teaching these children, and I intend to honor that commitment." Knox studied her for a moment, respect evident in his eyes. "I believe you, but we should take precautions. I notice someone's installing shutters," Mr. Harper and Mr. Cooper, Penelope confirmed. "They offered to do it without charge." "Good men," Knox said with approval. "The shutters will help, but I'm more concerned about your lodgings. They're isolated behind the store, easy to approach unseen." "What do you suggest?" Knox considered. "For now, be vigilant. Keep your doors locked. Don't walk alone after dark. I'll speak with some of the parents who support the school, see if they can arrange a rotation to keep an eye on both the schoolhouse and your lodgings." Penelope wanted to protest that such measures were unnecessary, that she could take care of herself. But the reality of frontier life was that a woman alone was vulnerable, particularly one who had made enemies. "All right," she agreed reluctantly. "But I won't hide or cower. The children need to see that education is worth standing up for, even in the face of opposition." "I wouldn't expect you to do otherwise," Knox said with a small smile. "You're not exactly the cowering type, Miss Davis." As they left the schoolhouse together, locking the newly secured shutters, Penelope was struck by how quickly her life had changed. A week ago, she had been the outsider, the fancy Eastern schoolmarm tolerated but not embraced by Primrose Gulch. Now she had allies in the community, students whose numbers were growing rather than dwindling. And this man beside her, who looked at her with respect and something warmer that made her heart beat faster. "I made some inquiries about the stagecoach robberies today," Knox said as they walked toward town. "Interesting pattern emerging. The robberies always occur at a particular bend in the road where the stage has to slow significantly. And they always happen on days when the weather is clear, never during rain or heavy cloud cover. That suggests someone who knows the terrain well and plans carefully," Penelope observed. "Exactly," Knox agreed. "I also spoke with the stage drivers. They say the robber works alone, wears a mask, and never speaks, just hands them a note demanding the mine payroll. Very methodical." "Have you spoken with Mr. Hollister about it? As the assayer, he would know which shipments contained payrolls." Knox nodded, briefly. "He was less than cooperative, claimed the mine has strict protocols about payroll shipments that only he and the mine owner know." "Do you believe him?" "Not entirely," Knox admitted. "But he's right that information could leak from other sources, the stage company itself, for instance." "I'll be riding out to the next station tomorrow to ask some questions there." They had reached the main street of Primrose Gulch, where people were beginning to gather for evening meals or drinks at the saloon. Penelope noticed the stares that followed them, some curious, some disapproving, some openly hostile. "We're causing quite a stir," she murmured. "The school teacher and the bounty hunter." "Let them stare," Knox said, echoing his words from their first meeting. "Maybe they'll learn something." Despite his light tone, Penelope could see Knox was constantly scanning their surroundings, alert to any potential threat. His vigilance was both reassuring and unsettling, a reminder that the anonymous note might represent a real danger rather than an empty threat. As they approached Mercer's store, Penelope spotted Bart Hollister emerging from the saloon across the street. His gaze fixed on them immediately, his expression hardening. Without warning, he started toward them, his stride purposeful. "Miss Davis," he called, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "A word, if you please." Knox subtly positioned himself slightly in front of Penelope, his posture casual but ready. "Mr. Hollister," he acknowledged coolly, "something on your mind." Hollister stopped a few paces away, his eyes flicking between them. "I was addressing the schoolteacher, not you, Lawson." "I'm right here, Mr. Hollister," Penelope said, stepping around Knox. "What can I do for you?" Hollister's expression was difficult to read: anger, certainly, but also something else, something almost like fear. "I understand you've been filling the children's heads with nonsense about becoming doctors and engineers," he said accusingly. Penelope lifted her chin. "I've been encouraging them to consider all possibilities for their futures. That's hardly nonsense." "It is when it gives them ideas above their station," Hollister retorted. "My clerk's daughter came home talking about medical school in Philadelphia. Medical school for a girl." "Emma is exceptionally bright," Penelope replied calmly. "She has a natural curiosity about how things work, including the human body. Why shouldn't she aspire to use those gifts?" "Because it's not the natural order of things," Hollister snapped. "Women have their place, and it's not in medical colleges or engineering firms. You're setting these children up for disappointment and failure." "I disagree," Penelope said firmly. "I'm showing them what's possible with education and determination. Whether they ultimately pursue those dreams is up to them and their families, but they deserve to know the options exist." Hollister's face flushed with anger. "This is exactly why that school should never have been opened. First reading and writing, then all these grand ideas that have no place in a town like this." He jabbed a finger in Penelope's direction. "You mark my words, Miss Davis, you're doing these children no favors with your progressive notions." "I think that's enough, Hollister," Knox interjected, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable edge. "Miss Davis is doing her job and doing it well. The council voted to keep the school open. The matter is settled." For a tense moment, it seemed Hollister might escalate the confrontation further, but something in Knox's steady gaze made him reconsider. With a final glare at Penelope, he turned and stalked back toward the saloon. "Are you all right?" Knox asked once Hollister was out of earshot. Penelope released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Yes." His reaction was extreme but not surprising. Men like Hollister fear change, especially when it threatens their sense of how the world should be ordered. Knox nodded thoughtfully. Still, there was something off about that encounter. It felt personal, beyond just opposition to progressive education. "Perhaps because his clerk's daughter is now talking about becoming a doctor," Penelope suggested, challenging not just his worldview but his authority in the community. They had reached Penelope's lodgings. Knox checked inside before allowing her to enter, a precaution that was becoming routine. Finding nothing amiss, he turned to her at the door. "I'll be leaving early tomorrow to ride to the stage station," he said, "but I'll be back by evening." "Will you be all right until then?" "Of course," Penelope assured him. "The shutters are installed at the school and I'll be surrounded by children all day. I doubt anyone would attempt anything under those circumstances." Knox still looked concerned. "Keep the note with you. If anything else happens, anything at all, take it to Dr. Wilson. He seems to be the most reasonable member of the town council." "I will," Penelope promised. "Be careful on the trail tomorrow. Stage robbers aren't known for their hospitality toward bounty hunters." "I can be quite charming when necessary," Knox replied with a smile that did interesting things to Penelope's pulse. "Besides, I have extra motivation to return safely." The look they shared held more meaning than either was ready to put into words. After a moment, Knox tipped his hat and departed, leaving Penelope to wonder exactly what he'd meant by extra motivation, and to hope it might be what her heart increasingly wished it to be. The following day passed with excruciating slowness. Penelope threw herself into teaching, presenting lessons with extra vigor to keep her mind off both the threatening note and Knox's absence. But as afternoon stretched toward evening with no sign of him, worry began to gnaw at her. The stage station was only a few hours' ride from Primrose Gulch. Even accounting for time spent asking questions, Knox should have returned by now. Had he found something or someone that delayed him? Or had something gone wrong? As she dismissed the children and secured the schoolhouse, Penelope debated what to do. She could return to her lodgings and wait, trusting that Knox knew how to take care of himself. Or she could seek information. Perhaps the stage had arrived in town, and its driver might know if Knox had reached the station. Deciding on the latter course, she walked briskly toward the center of town, where the stagecoach made its regular stop outside the hotel. Luck was with her. The coach had just arrived, and the driver was unloading mail and parcels while passengers stretched their legs after the jolting journey. "Excuse me," Penelope approached the driver, a weathered man she recognized as Sam Calloway, who made the Denver to Primrose Gulch run twice weekly. "I'm wondering if you happen to see a man named Knox Lawson at the Elk Creek station today." Calloway looked up from his work, recognition crossing his face. "You'd be the school teacher, Miss Davis, right?" At her nod, he continued, "Lawson was there all right. Asking a lot of questions about the robberies. Left just as we were arriving, headed up toward Copper Canyon." "Copper Canyon." Penelope repeated, puzzled. "Why would he go there?" The driver shrugged. "Didn't say, but he seemed in a mighty hurry, like he'd picked up a hot trail." Penelope thanked him and walked away, her concern deepening. Copper Canyon was notorious for its difficult terrain and isolated location. It was also rumored to be a hideout for outlaws and fugitives, though most gave it a wide berth due to its treacherous approaches. If Knox had gone there, he must have had good reason. But she couldn't shake the feeling that he might be riding into danger. The stagecoach robber had successfully evaded capture for months. If Knox was closing in on him, the confrontation could be perilous. As dusk settled over Primrose Gulch, Penelope returned to her lodgings, torn between worry for Knox and frustration at her own helplessness. There was nothing she could do if he was in trouble except wait and hope for his safe return. She was just lighting a lamp when a soft knock came at her door. Heart leaping with hope, she hurried to answer it, only to find not Knox but Dr. Wilson standing on her doorstep, his expression grave. "Doctor Wilson," she greeted him, unable to hide her disappointment. "Is something wrong? May I come in, Miss Davis?" the doctor asked quietly. "I have some information that might concern you." Penelope stepped back, allowing him entry. "Of course, please sit down." The doctor declined the offered chair, remaining standing. "I'll be brief. I've just come from treating a patient at the Silver Bell mine, one of the foremen. During our conversation, he mentioned something troubling. It seems there's a group of men planning to take matters into their own hands regarding the school." Penelope felt a chill despite the warm evening. "What do you mean, take matters into their own hands?" "He wasn't specific," Dr. Wilson said, clearly uncomfortable. "But the impression I got was that they intend some kind of action to force the school's closure, regardless of the council's vote." "Do you know who these men are?" Penelope asked. The doctor hesitated. He didn't name names, but he did say they plan to act soon, possibly tonight. Penelope's mind raced. The anonymous note had given her until week's end to leave town. It was only Wednesday. If Dr. Wilson's information was correct, someone had decided not to wait for the deadline. "Thank you for warning me," she said, striving to keep her voice steady. "I appreciate your concern." Dr. Wilson studied her with professional assessment. "You should consider staying elsewhere tonight, Miss Davis. Mrs. Wilson and I have a spare room. You'd be welcome to use it." The offer was tempting, but Penelope shook her head. "Thank you, but I can't abandon my home at the first hint of trouble. That would only encourage whoever is behind these threats." "This is more than a hint, Miss Davis," the doctor said gravely. "I fear these men are quite serious." "As am I," Penelope replied firmly. "I came to Primrose Gulch to teach, and I won't be driven away by intimidation." Dr. Wilson sighed, clearly disapproving but recognizing her determination. "At least let me send my son to keep watch tonight. He's a responsible young man and handy with a rifle if needed." "That won't be necessary," came a voice from the doorway. They both turned to see Knox standing there, his clothes dusty from the trail, his expression hard as granite. "Mr. Lawson," Dr. Wilson acknowledged, looking relieved. "I'm glad to see you've returned. I was just informing Miss Davis of a potential threat." "I heard," Knox said, stepping inside and closing the door. "And I appreciate your concern for her safety, Doctor, but I'll be staying here tonight." Penelope felt her cheeks flush at the implication, but before she could clarify, Knox continued. "On the porch," he specified. "I've learned some things today that make me believe Miss Davis may indeed be in danger." Dr. Wilson nodded, seemingly satisfied with this arrangement. "Very well. I'll leave you to discuss the matter. Miss Davis, please reconsider my offer if circumstances change." With a formal bow, he departed, leaving Penelope alone with Knox. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Despite his dusty appearance and evident fatigue, Knox's eyes were alert, his posture tense with contained energy. "What did you learn at Copper Canyon?" Penelope asked, breaking the silence. Knox's eyebrows rose slightly. "How did you know I went there?" "Mr. Calloway, the stage driver, mentioned it," she explained. "I was worried when you didn't return by afternoon." Something in Knox's expression softened at her admission of concern. "I'm sorry to have worried you. I found a lead at the stage station that I couldn't ignore." He moved further into the room, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair. The station manager mentioned seeing a lone rider heading toward Copper Canyon after each of the robberies. Always the same description: man on a bay horse with a white blaze, moving fast like he knew the terrain well. "And you think this rider is the stagecoach robber?" Knox nodded. "It fits the pattern." "But when I reached Copper Canyon, there was no sign of anyone, no camp, no horse tracks recent enough to matter. If he's hiding out there, he's covering his tracks well." "So you came back empty-handed," Penelope said sympathetically. "Not entirely," Knox replied, his expression grim. "On the return journey, I ran into a prospector who mentioned hearing about a planned action against the school. According to him, a group of miners intend to burn the schoolhouse tonight." Penelope gasped. "Burn it? But that's criminal," Knox finished for her. "Yes, and dangerous. The schoolhouse is close enough to other buildings that a fire could spread." "Dr. Wilson heard something similar from a mine foreman," Penelope said, connecting the pieces. "But he didn't mention burning, just some kind of action to force the school's closure." Knox's jaw tightened. "It's escalating then, from anonymous threats to planned arson." "What should we do?" Penelope asked, practical despite her shock. "Alert Sheriff Bolton." "I already tried," Knox said, frustration evident in his tone. "He claims he can't act on vague rumors and suggested I'm stirring up trouble to extend my stay in town." "Of course he did," Penelope muttered. "So we're on our own." "Not entirely," Knox corrected her. "I spoke with Mr. Harper on my way here. He and some of the other parents are gathering at the schoolhouse tonight. They'll keep watch." Penelope felt a rush of gratitude for these allies she hadn't known she had until recently. "And you intend to stay here, on my porch, if that's acceptable to you," Knox said. "I don't want to presume, but I'd rest easier knowing you're safe." "It's more than acceptable," Penelope assured him. "Though I have a better idea than the porch. I have a comfortable armchair where you could at least doze, and I can make up a pallet if you prefer to lie down." Knox looked about to protest, then seemed to reconsider. "Thank you, the armchair will be fine, but first you should eat something. I noticed you were heading home when I arrived. Have you had dinner?" Penelope shook her head. "I was too worried to think about food." "Then allow me to remedy that," Knox said, reaching into his saddlebag, which he'd left by the door. "It's nothing fancy, just jerky, biscuits, and an apple I picked up at the stage station, but it's better than going hungry." They shared this simple meal sitting at Penelope's small table, the intimacy of the situation not lost on either of them. Under normal circumstances, a single woman inviting a man to stay in her home, even on her porch, would be scandalous. But these were not normal circumstances, and Penelope found she cared less and less about the town's opinion of her. As they ate, Knox filled her in on more of what he'd learned about the stagecoach robberies. The pattern was distinctive: always the same approach, always the same method, always the same target. "It's almost as if the robber is following a script," he observed. "Nothing improvised, nothing left to chance." "That suggests someone methodical, someone who plans carefully," Penelope said thoughtfully. "Not your typical desperado." "Exactly what I was thinking," Knox agreed. "And there's something else, something that's been bothering me since I arrived in town." "What's that?" Knox hesitated, then seemed to decide to trust her completely. The timing of these robberies coincides with when the previous schoolteacher, Martha Williams, left town. Penelope stared at him. You think Martha was involved in the robberies? That's unlikely, I know, Knox conceded. But the timing is curious, and no one in town seems to remember much about her, which is strange for a small community like this. Maybe she was just private, Penelope suggested, though she had to admit the connection was intriguing. Or maybe there's no connection at all. Maybe, Knox allowed, but in my experience, coincidences often aren't. As night deepened, they moved from speculations about the robberies to more personal conversation. Despite the tension of the situation, or perhaps, because of it, Penelope found herself sharing thoughts she'd told no one else. Her initial loneliness in Primrose Gulch, her doubts about making a difference, her determination to prove that education could transform even the most resistant community. In turn, Knox spoke of his siblings, now scattered across the West, one brother ranching in Wyoming, another working for the railroad, his sisters both married with children of their own. He described Christmas gatherings at his brother's ranch, the only time they were all together, and the letters that connected them during the long months between. You miss them, Penelope observed. Every day, Knox admitted, but they're building their own lives as they should. And my work doesn't lend itself to settling down. There was something in his tone, a hint of regret, perhaps that made Penelope wonder if he was entirely satisfied with his nomadic existence. But before she could pursue that thought, a sound from outside caught their attention, the distant crack of a gunshot, followed by shouting. Knox was on his feet instantly, moving to the window with practiced caution. It's coming from the direction of the schoolhouse, he said grimly. Penelope joined him at the window, straining to see through the darkness. In the distance, a faint glow was visible, not the bright flame of a building fully ablaze, but the smaller light of torches or lanterns moving erratically. They're there, she whispered. At the school. Knox was already reaching for his gun belt. Stay here, he instructed. Lock the door behind me, I'll go see what's happening. No, Penelope said firmly. I'm coming with you, that's my school, my responsibility. Penelope, Knox began, clearly preparing to argue. I'm coming, she repeated, already reaching for her shawl. Either with you or after you, but I'm not staying here while people threaten everything I've worked for. Knox studied her determined expression, then nodded once, a mixture of exasperation and respect in his eyes. Stay behind me and do exactly as I say. If there's real danger, you retreat immediately. Agreed, Penelope said, though they both knew it was at best a conditional promise. They moved quickly through the darkened town, keeping to shadows where possible. As they neared the schoolhouse, the shouting became clearer, angry male voices, the responses of Harper and the other parents who had come to stand guard. Rounding the final corner, they found a tense standoff. On one side, perhaps a dozen miners, several holding torches, led by a man Penelope recognized as Joe Simmons, one of Hollister's closest associates at the mine. On the other side, Mr. Harper, Mr. Cooper, and 4 other men, all parents of Penelope's students, stood firmly between the miners and the schoolhouse, some armed with rifles, others with tools that could serve as weapons if needed. This doesn't concern you, Harper, Simmons was saying as Knox and Penelope approached. We're just going to make sure this town doesn't waste any more money on fancy education nobody needs. By burning down a building, Harper responded incredulously. Have you lost your mind, Simmons? You'll put the whole town at risk. We're just going to make sure it can't be used anymore, another miner insisted. A little fire, carefully controlled. There's no such thing as a carefully controlled fire in a wooden building, Mr. Cooper countered. One spark catches the wrong way and half the town could go up. Knox stepped forward, his presence immediately commanding attention. Put those torches out, he ordered, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Now. Simmons turned, his expression hardening when he recognized Knox. This isn't your business, bounty hunter. You're not even from around here. Arson is everyone's business, Knox replied evenly, and threatening a school full of children's futures, that makes it my business for certain. The school stays open, Penelope added, moving to stand beside Knox despite his warning glance. The town council voted. The parents want it. You have no right to override that decision with violence. Simmons spat on the ground. Council vote was a sham. Hollister says what? Came a new voice as Sheriff Bolton emerged from the shadows, lantern in hand. Because I'd be mighty interested to hear what Bart Hollister has to do with this little gathering. Simmons faltered, clearly not expecting the sheriff's appearance. I didn't mean, that is, we just thought. You just thought you'd commit arson against town property, Bolton finished for him. That's a serious offense, Simmons, one that could land you and your friends in the territorial prison for a good long while. Penelope was as surprised by Bolton's intervention as Simmons appeared to be. The sheriff had shown little interest in protecting either her or the school until now. What had changed? As if reading her thoughts, Knox murmured, "Look who's with him." Penelope glanced beyond the sheriff and saw Mayor Fletcher approaching, along with Dr. Wilson and Reverend Thomas. 3/5 of the town council, presenting a united front against the would-be arsonists. The council has spoken on this matter, Mayor Fletcher announced, his voice carrying the authority of his office. The school remains open. Anyone who takes action against that decision is acting against the town itself. The miners shifted uncomfortably, their earlier bravado fading in the face of official opposition. One by one, they extinguished their torches, muttering among themselves. "Go home," Sheriff Bolton ordered. "All of you, and count yourselves lucky I'm not arresting the lot of you tonight." As the miners dispersed, Penelope turned to the mayor and council members. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "But how did you know what was happening, my son?" Dr. Wilson explained. "After our conversation, he was concerned enough to keep an eye on things. When he saw the miners gathering with torches, he alerted me, and I contacted the others." "Primrose Gulch may have its disagreements," Mayor Fletcher added, "but we settle them through proper channels, not through destruction and intimidation." The crisis averted, the gathered crowd began to disperse. Harper and the other parents promised to continue their watch through the night, despite the sheriff's assurances that no further trouble would occur. As Knox and Penelope walked back toward her lodgings, the adrenaline of the confrontation gradually faded, leaving Penelope feeling drained but relieved. "That could have gone very differently," she observed quietly. Knox nodded, his expression thoughtful. Bolton's intervention was unexpected. He's shown little interest in enforcing the law until now. Perhaps he finally decided to do his job, Penelope suggested, though she shared Knox's skepticism. "Perhaps," Knox allowed, "or perhaps something else is happening that we don't fully understand yet." They walked in silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Then Penelope said, "I keep thinking about what Simmons started to say. Hollister says, what do you think he was going to reveal?" "I don't know," Knox replied, "but I intend to find out." Hollister's opposition to the school seems personal, beyond what would be reasonable even for a man of his conservative views. They had reached Penelope's lodgings. Inside, the armchair Knox would use for the night waited, along with the uncertainty of what tomorrow might bring. But as they stood in the doorway, neither quite ready to end the conversation, Penelope realized something important. For the first time since arriving in Primrose Gulch, she didn't feel alone. Whatever challenges lay ahead, threats to the school, mysterious connections to stagecoach robberies, the hostility of men like Hollister, she now had allies. She had Harper and the other parents. She had the support of at least some council members. And she had Knox Lawson, whose steady presence beside her felt increasingly like something she couldn't bear to lose. "Penny, for your thoughts," Knox said softly, breaking into her reflection. Penelope smiled at the familiar phrase. "I was just thinking that I'm grateful you happened to arrive in Primrose Gulch when you did." "I'm beginning to think it wasn't just happenstance," Knox replied, his expression serious. "When I was in Copper Canyon today, I kept feeling like I was missing something important, something right in front of me." "About the stagecoach robber, about everything," Knox said. "The robberies, the opposition to the school, Hollister's behavior, even Bolton's sudden interest in doing his job. There's a pattern here that I can't quite see yet." Penelope considered this. "Martha Williams," she said suddenly. the previous teacher. You mentioned the timing of her departure coinciding with the robberies. What if there's more to that connection? Knox's eyes sharpened with interest. Go on. I don't know exactly, Penelope admitted, but you're right that no one talks about her. When I first arrived and asked questions about my predecessor, people were oddly vague. I assumed it was just because she hadn't made much of an impression, but what if there's another reason? What if she saw or knew something she shouldn't have? Knox suggested, following her train of thought. Something about the robberies or about whoever is behind them. And what if her leaving wasn't entirely voluntary? Penelope continued, the possibilities unfolding in her mind. What if she was encouraged or forced to leave because of what she knew? Knox nodded slowly. It would explain why someone searched your lodgings so thoroughly. They might have been looking for something Martha left behind, something that could identify the robber. But I never met Martha, Penelope objected. She was already gone when I arrived. Whatever she knew, she didn't share it with me. Maybe she left it for you to find, Knox suggested. Something hidden that you might discover in the course of your duties. Penelope frowned, thinking hard. The only things of Martha's I received were her teaching materials, some books, lesson plans, the attendance ledger. The ledger, Knox said sharply. A record of which children attended school and when. Could there be a connection to the robberies there? Penelope's eyes widened as understanding dawned. The attendance dropped sharply for certain children about a month before I arrived. I assumed it was just growing opposition to the school, but what if it was something else? What if Martha noticed a pattern, children absent on the same days as the robberies? Perhaps children whose fathers work at the mine, Knox added, the pieces beginning to fit together. Children who might innocently mention their father's unusual activities on certain days. The ledger is at the schoolhouse, Penelope said, already reaching for her shawl again. We should check it now while we're thinking of this. Knox hesitated. It's late, and there's been enough excitement for one night. The ledger will still be there in the morning. But what if someone else has the same realization we just had? Penelope countered. What if they destroy the evidence before we can examine it? Knox studied her determined expression, then nodded reluctantly. All right, but we go carefully, and at the first sign of trouble we retreat. No arguments. No arguments, Penelope agreed, and this time she meant it. The walk back to the schoolhouse was tense but uneventful. Harper and two other fathers were still keeping watch, surprised but cooperative when Knox explained they needed to check something inside. The schoolhouse was dark and quiet, the newly installed shutters casting strange shadows in the lantern light. Penelope went directly to her desk, where the attendance ledger was kept in the top drawer. Opening it, she flipped back to the pages covering the months before her arrival. Here, she said, pointing to entries from February through April. Martha kept meticulous records. Look at these patterns. These 5 children were absent on the same days about every 3 weeks. Knox examined the ledger carefully. And these dates, he said, pointing to the absences. Do they correlate with the stagecoach robberies? Penelope nodded slowly. I think they might. The first robbery was reported in the territorial newspaper in early February. There were others in March and April. Whose children were absent? Knox asked, peering at the names. Can you match them to parents? Penelope ran her finger down the list. Thomas Wilson, that's the doctor's son. John and Peter Cooper, William Harper, and, she paused, surprised, Emma Hollister. Hollister, Knox repeated, eyebrows rising, as in Bart Hollister, the assayer. No, Penelope clarified. Emma's father is Frank Hollister, Bart's younger brother. He works as a clerk in the assayer's office. Knox's expression turned thoughtful. So Emma's father would have access to the same information as Bart when payrolls are being shipped. Yes, but Frank is. Well, he's different from Bart, Penelope explained. Quieter, more bookish. Emma takes after him in that regard. I can't imagine him involved in robberies. People can surprise you, Knox said, but he didn't press the point. Instead, he continued studying the ledger. There's something else here. Look at these notes in the margin. Penelope leaned closer, squinting at Martha's neat handwriting. Beside each date where the 5 children were absent, she had made a small notation. CC visit. CC, Knox repeated. Copper Canyon, it could be, Penelope agreed. But why would all 5 children be visiting Copper Canyon on the same days? And why those specific days? Knox's expression had turned grim. Because someone was using those children as cover, he said quietly. Someone who needed an alibi for being away from town on the days of the robberies. Understanding dawned on Penelope. You think someone was taking the children on outings to Copper Canyon while using the opportunity to rob the stagecoach? Knox nodded slowly. It would explain the pattern. The children would provide an innocent explanation for the absence, and who would suspect someone accompanied by children of being a stagecoach robber. But who would do such a thing? Penelope wondered. Who had access to all 5 children and the trust of their parents? They looked at each other as the same answer occurred to both simultaneously. Martha Williams, Penelope whispered. The school teacher. The realization was shocking but made a terrible kind of sense. As the town's teacher, Martha would have had the trust of parents. Taking children on educational outings would raise no suspicions, and if she had learned through Emma's father when payrolls were being shipped. But why? Penelope asked, still struggling to accept this theory. Why would a school teacher risk everything to rob stagecoaches? Money, Knox suggested. Or perhaps revenge. We know nothing about Martha's background or what might have motivated her. Penelope shook her head, troubled by something else. If Martha was the robber, why did the robberies continue after she left? There have been at least 2 since I arrived in Primrose Gulch. Knox frowned, considering this. You're right. That doesn't fit the pattern. He turned back to the ledger, examining the most recent entries, those made by Penelope herself. What about absences since you took over the school? Any patterns there? Penelope flipped forward to her own records. There's been so much fluctuation in attendance that it's hard to see a clear pattern. Children have been withdrawn and returned as community sentiment shifted. She paused, studying the pages more carefully. Although Emma Hollister was absent on the days of both recent robberies. Just Emma? Knox asked sharply. Yes, Penelope confirmed, checking her records again. The other 4 children were present. Knox's expression grew even more serious. So the pattern changed. No more group outings to Copper Canyon, but Emma is still absent on robbery days. You think Frank Hollister might be involved? Penelope asked, finding it difficult to reconcile this theory with the quiet, nervous man she occasionally saw walking his daughter to school. Or someone is using Emma's absence as cover, Knox suggested. Someone who would have a reason to be with her when she's not in school. Penelope thought about this. Her mother died 2 years ago. Frank often works long hours at the assayer's office. On days when Emma isn't in school, she usually stays with her Uncle Bart or with Sheriff Bolton's wife, who's a distant cousin of the Hollisters. Bolton, Knox repeated, something clicking into place. That's why he's been so reluctant to investigate the robberies or to take threats against the school seriously. He's protecting someone. But who? Penelope pressed. Bart Hollister, Frank, or someone else entirely? Before Knox could respond, a sound from outside caught their attention, horses approaching at speed. Harper appeared in the doorway, his expression urgent. Riders coming, he reported. Looks like Hollister and some of his men. Knox moved quickly to the window, peering through a gap in the shutters. 6 riders, he confirmed grimly. Bart Hollister in the lead, and they don't look like they're here for a friendly visit. They must have realized we're putting it together, Penelope said, clutching the ledger. What do we do? Knox's mind worked rapidly, weighing options. Harper, get word to Mayor Fletcher and Dr. Wilson, tell them what we've discovered about the ledger and the robbery patterns. Penelope and I will try to reach the sheriff's office with the evidence. The sheriff? Harper questioned dubiously. If he's involved. We don't know that for certain, Knox replied. And his office is the most secure building in town. It's our best chance to protect both Penelope and the evidence until we can sort this out. Harper nodded and slipped out the back way. Outside, they could hear Hollister shouting demands to search the schoolhouse. Ready? Knox asked Penelope, his hand on his gun. Penelope tucked the ledger securely under her arm and nodded. Ready. They exited through the back door, moving swiftly but quietly toward the side street that would lead them to the sheriff's office. Behind them, they could hear Hollister and his men dismounting, their voices raised in anger as they confronted the parents standing guard. We need to hurry, Knox urged, keeping Penelope close beside him. Once they realize we're not in the schoolhouse, they'll come looking for us. They moved through the darkened streets of Primrose Gulch, the sheriff's office tantalizingly close. But as they rounded the final corner, they found their path blocked by two men, Frank Hollister and Sheriff Bolton himself. "That's far enough," Bolton said, his hand resting on his holstered pistol. "Hand over the ledger, Miss Davis." Penelope clutched the book tighter. "You know what's in it," she realized aloud. "You know it contains evidence." "Evidence of nothing," Frank Hollister insisted, his normally nervous demeanor replaced by a hard, desperate edge. "Just a school teacher's notes and children's attendance records. Then why do you want it so badly?" Knox challenged, subtly positioning himself between Penelope and the two men. "Because it's school property," Bolton replied smoothly. "Not something to be removed in the middle of the night by a bounty hunter with no official standing in this town." "We know about the robberies," Penelope said, deciding to confront them directly. "We know about Martha Williams's involvement, and we know about the continued pattern with Emma's absences." Frank's face paled visibly even in the dim light. "You don't understand," he said, his voice shaking. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. No one was ever hurt." "Frank," Bolton warned, "shut your mouth," but Frank seemed beyond heeding warnings. "It was Martha's idea at first," he continued, words spilling out like water through a broken dam. "She needed the money for her sister's medical treatments back east. I helped her with the information about the shipments. It was just supposed to be once or twice." "Frank," Bolton barked, more urgently. "Then Bart found out," Frank went on, ignoring the sheriff. "He threatened to expose us unless we cut him in, and when Martha wanted to stop, to return east with what she'd saved. He forced her to leave without exposing the operation," Knox finished for him, pieces falling into place, "and found someone to replace her as both schoolteacher and robber." All eyes turned to Bolton, whose hand had moved to grip his pistol more firmly. "You," Penelope breathed, understanding dawning. "That's why you've been so opposed to my presence in town. You needed someone who would continue Martha's role, someone you could control." "Martha was smart," Bolton admitted, his facade of lawful authority crumbling. "She figured out a way to rob the stages without violence, without witnesses who could identify her. All it took was information about the shipments and careful timing. And when she wanted out, you and Hollister threatened her," Knox said, his voice hard with contempt. "Forced her to leave everything behind and keep her mouth shut." Bolton shrugged. "She got what she wanted, enough money for her sister's care. We got a profitable arrangement. Everyone won." "Except for the mine workers whose pay was delayed," Penelope countered. "Except for Martha, who had to abandon her students and her reputation." "Details," Bolton dismissed. "Now the ledger, Miss Davis. It's the only concrete evidence linking the robberies to specific dates and patterns." Penelope glanced at Knox, seeking guidance. His slight nod was nearly imperceptible, but she understood his meaning. Slowly, she extended the ledger toward Bolton. As the sheriff reached for it, Knox moved with lightning speed. In one fluid motion, he drew his pistol and struck Bolton's outstretched arm, sending the sheriff's weapon clattering to the ground. Frank Hollister stumbled backward, raising his hands in immediate surrender. "You're under arrest, Sheriff," Knox said, his voice carrying the authority that Bolton's had always lacked. "For conspiracy to commit robbery, for intimidation, and for abuse of your office." Bolton's face contorted with rage. "You have no authority here, Lawson. You're just a bounty hunter, not a lawman." "Actually," came a new voice from the shadows, "he does have authority." Mayor Fletcher stepped into view, accompanied by Dr. Wilson and a man Penelope didn't recognize, a tall figure wearing a silver star on his vest. U.S. Marshal James Harker, the stranger introduced himself. "Mr. Lawson has been working with my office to investigate the string of robberies. We've suspected local involvement for some time but lacked the evidence to act." Bolton's shoulders slumped as he realized the game was up. Frank Hollister seemed almost relieved, the burden of his secrets finally lifted. "What about Bart?" Knox asked the marshal. "He's at the schoolhouse with his men, likely destroying evidence as we speak." "Already handled," Marshal Harker assured him. "My deputies were waiting for your signal." "Bart Hollister and his associates are in custody." As Bolton and Frank were led away, Penelope turned to Knox, questions flooding her mind. "You were working with the marshals all along. Why didn't you tell me?" "I couldn't," Knox replied, regret evident in his expression. "Not at first. We didn't know who was involved or how deep the conspiracy went. I needed to establish trust with you independently without revealing my connection to the investigation." "And when were you planning to tell me?" Penelope asked, hurt despite her understanding of the necessity. Knox's expression softened. "Tonight, actually, after we confirmed our suspicions about the ledger. I never intended to keep you in the dark once I was sure you weren't involved and could be trusted." Marshal Harker approached them, extending his hand for the ledger. "This will be important evidence, Miss Davis. We'll need to take it into custody." Penelope surrendered the book, still processing everything that had happened. "What about the school?" she asked. "With both Hollister brothers and the sheriff arrested, there will be even more opposition from their supporters." "I wouldn't be so sure," Mayor Fletcher said, joining the conversation. "The townspeople respect law and order. When they learn that these men have been stealing from the mine payroll money meant for their own wages, I suspect sentiment will shift rather dramatically." Dr. Wilson nodded in agreement. "And the council's vote stands. The school remains open, with you as its teacher, Miss Davis." As the immediate crisis subsided, Penelope found herself overwhelmed by the events of the night. Knox must have noticed, because he gently guided her toward a nearby bench. "Sit for a moment," he urged. "It's been a long night." As they sat together under the stars, the town gradually settling back into an uneasy quiet around them, Penelope turned to face Knox directly. "Now what?" she asked simply. Knox understood the layers in her question. What happened next with the investigation, with the town with them? "Marshal Harker will handle the legal proceedings against Bolton and the Hollisters," he explained. "There will be a trial, likely in Denver. Your testimony about the ledger and Martha's notes will be important. And after that," Penelope pressed, her eyes searching his. Knox hesitated, the question he'd been avoiding now unavoidable. "Normally, I'd move on to the next assignment. There are always more fugitives to track, more problems to solve." "Normally," Penelope repeated softly. "Is that what you plan to do this time?" Knox looked at her for a long moment, his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. "I don't know," he admitted. "For the first time in years, I find myself reluctant to move on." Penelope felt her heart quicken at his words. "Because of the case. Because of you," Knox said simply. "You've made me question things I've taken for granted for a long time, my solitary life, my constant movement from place to place. Being here with you has felt different, important in a way that tracking fugitives never has." Penelope took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Then don't go," she said. "At least not yet. Stay in Primrose Gulch. Help the town rebuild after this scandal. Help me continue what Martha started with the school before everything went wrong." Knox reached out, taking her hand in his. "Are you sure that's what you want?" A former bounty hunter with no permanent address and a habit of finding trouble. "I'm sure that I want you," Penelope replied, her voice steady despite the boldness of her declaration. "The rest we can figure out together." Under the vast Colorado sky, with the town that had once scorned her now transformed by revelations and new beginnings, Knox Lawson did what he had wanted to do since the moment he first saw Penelope Davis holding her head high despite the laughter that followed her. He drew her close and kissed her, a promise sealed beneath the watchful stars. 2 years later, Penelope Davis Lawson stood on the porch of the newly expanded schoolhouse, watching as students of all ages filed in for the first day of the fall term. The town of Primrose Gulch had changed dramatically since the arrests of Sheriff Bolton and the Hollister brothers. With their corrupting influence removed, the community had gradually healed, becoming a place that valued education alongside industry. The mine still operated, but under new management that recognized the importance of diversification. Knox, using connections from his former profession, had helped attract a small lumber mill and a way station for the expanding railroad, ensuring the town wouldn't die when the silver eventually played out. As for Knox himself, he had found a new purpose in Primrose Gulch. While he occasionally still took assignments tracking fugitives, He now served as the town's duly elected sheriff, bringing to the role the integrity and fairness that Bolton had so conspicuously lacked. Their courtship had progressed with the same forthright honesty that characterized them both. 6 months after the night at the schoolhouse, Knox had proposed on the very spot where they first met, the dusty street, where he had told her to let them watch you ride home proud. Their wedding, held in the schoolhouse with students serving as attendants, had united not just two people, but symbolized the town's new beginning. Now, as Penelope prepared to ring the bell that would start the new school year, she felt a presence behind her and turned to find Knox watching her with the same admiration that had been in his eyes from the beginning. "Quite a difference from your first day," he observed, nodding toward the 20-plus students chattering excitedly as they took their seats. "Quite," Penelope agreed, smiling. "No one's laughing now." "They never should have," Knox said, stepping closer to place a gentle hand on her still flat stomach, where their first child was just beginning to grow. "And if they do, you'll always ride home proud with me beside you." Penelope covered his hand with hers, the simple gold band on her finger catching the morning light. "I wouldn't have it any other way." As she rang the bell to begin the day's lessons, Penelope thought of all the unlikely events that had brought her to this moment: a desperate letter from a schoolteacher involved in robbery, a town resistant to change, a mysterious bounty hunter with unexpected depths. What had begun with mockery had transformed into respect. What had started as survival had blossomed into belonging, and what had sparked as attraction had deepened into enduring love. And as she watched Knox walk toward his office, turning once to tip his hat to her with that smile that still made her heart race, Penelope Davis Lawson knew that sometimes the most beautiful journeys began with the most difficult first steps, and that walking proud, even when others laughed, could lead to riding home victorious, with the love of a lifetime by your side.